Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us for today's webinar. It's a panel on the state of Jenkins and DevOps. We have a lot to go over, so I'm just going to announce a few things real quick up top. I want to let everyone know that we are recording this. The recording will be made available later on. You are also able to send questions in via the questions pane, so please do so. We'll be able to get to some at the end. There's a good chance that we won't be able to get to all of them, but we will be able to follow up later on. So even if you're not sure if we can get to it on the session, please send it along. We will receive it. So I want to get right into things. I'd like to introduce our moderator for today, a DevOps evangelist at CloudBees, Brian Dawson. Brian.
Thank you, Max, and thank you everybody for joining us today. I'd like to get started by introducing our panelists, and to each of you guys who have joined us today, thank you for joining. We were fortunate enough today to assemble what is a pretty varied and very knowledgeable panel. These are all not only people that I personally respect and have had, for the most part, in-depth conversations around CD, DevOps, and software delivery with, but there are also people that are doing impressive things in the market, impressive things within their organization, and have a deep accumulated knowledge of not only Jenkins, but generally CD, continuous delivery, and DevOps. So I'm going to go left to right. I'd like to start by introducing the guy with the initial for a first name, R. Tyler Croy, who is a colleague of mine, but I think more notably, he is a longtime Jenkins user, as well as a Jenkins project contributor and board member. Tyler, can you go ahead and take a second to introduce yourself?
Sure. What I would say my credentials are for why I got invited to this panel, aside from being part of the Jenkins project, is I've worked on the Jenkins project infrastructure for about the last 4 or 5 years through our transition from unmanaged infrastructure to Puppet managed infrastructure, and now as we have partnered with Microsoft on Azure, moving into Kubernetes and more into containers. So this is right in my wheelhouse. I'm looking forward to this panel.
Awesome. Thank you, Tyler. Appreciate having you. And then next we'll go over to Curtis Yanko. Curtis is here with us from Sonatype, where he's a senior principal solutions architect. Curtis, can you go ahead and take a moment to introduce yourself?
Sure thing, Brian. Thanks. So my story begins in the mid-90s, back when it was just SCM and someone who could manage code repositories, and then it sort of evolved into build and release engineering and culminated with 12 years in Fortune 100 companies where I did centralized build services and then later a DevOps Center of Excellence. In the 2 years I've been with Sonatype now, though, I get to talk to dozens of different customers across different verticals and sort of see where they're at and what they're doing. So hopefully I can bring a longitudinal and a current view to the discussion.
Awesome. Thank you, Curtis. And next we'll go over to Josh, who is actually a Jenkins user, where he works at Electronic Arts. He is the technical director and the product owner of the development and release engineering team. Welcome, Josh.
Thanks, Brian. Yeah, so as noted, I'm sort of lead for the development and release engineering team. That's Electronic Arts' central sort of CI/CD team. I've been doing this for about 10 years with Electronic Arts, basically getting it from titles that did very little, even continuous integration, to being able to completely not to be able to do their development effectively without it. We run a couple hundred Jenkins servers, thousands of slaves, and so many jobs each day it isn't even funny. But that's what it takes to get those games out the door.
Thank you, Josh. And yeah, hopefully as we go through some of the questions and have the discussion, we'll get to hear a little bit more about those numbers. Thousands of built, thousands of servers. I think EA is in a particularly unique situation when it comes to implementing continuous delivery and DevOps. So your input is very valuable and very welcome. So next, I'd like to go ahead. We're going to jump in the video panel over to Carl Kahn of Puppet, where he's a technical marketing manager and also somebody that I particularly wanted to involve in this because he is the creator of a powerful plugin, a plugin that I'm personally impressed with and see a ton of value, and that's the Puppet Enterprise plugin for Jenkins Pipeline, and hopefully he'll get to talk a bit about that today. Carl, can you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks. So I work at Puppet doing technical marketing. I've been there almost 6 years. I'm a recovering sysadmin. So before Puppet, I was a Puppet user doing administration of global infrastructure. I've been talking about continuous delivery and for a while now and helping people understand the challenges around it and how to get started with it. So I'm looking forward to talking about that today.
Thank you, sir. And then last, but of course not least, we're going to go over to Sid Siddiqui of Zebra, where he's the technology director of the cloud consulting practice. Can you go ahead and introduce yourself, Sid?
Thanks, Brian. Excited to be part of this panel. This is Waqas Siddiqui, also go by Sid. Started off my career, just as Curtis stated, that as an SDM deployment build-in deployment manager. 18 years plus later, jumping off multiple enterprises, I found a startup company called Zebra, and working as a consultant and a strategist for DevOps strategy and roadmaps and also implementation. Working also helping clients out from the organizational aspect of it. Excited to be part here. That's all.
Awesome. Thank you, Sid. And again, thanks all you guys for joining. I think you add significant value to this panel, and hopefully together, we're going to provide the attendees significant value with our discussion. Before I move on, I can't help but call out that somebody in the panel had noted that Nixdorf rules. So welcome. So now the bar's high, Josh. If you guys weren't aware, the format of this panel is, or the goal of this panel is to use the 2016 Jenkins Community Survey as a focal point for discussing the state of Jenkins and Jenkins adoption, but then more importantly, how that relates to what we're all seeing with CD and DevOps in the field or in our own organizations. What we hope to be able to spawn is discussion not only around the why of the responses that we'll cover, but also to be able to provide you practical guidance and insights as to the how for each of the subjects or responses of the survey that we'll discover. If you're not familiar with the Jenkins Community Survey, the Jenkins Community Survey is a survey of the Jenkins community, which is run and sponsored by CloudBees with the input and under the guidance of the Jenkins community. We've been conducting these since about 2012, though there have been some gaps. The most recent survey, which we're going to discuss, was conducted between September and October of 2016 through various channels, including Jenkins World, online, through social media promotions. So we tried to get as wide of a response group as we could. We ended up fielding 1,200 responses from 42 countries and getting input from a wide range of roles. The roles of people that responded included, but were not limited to, people that considered themselves DevOps, developers, architects, people that identified as being in IT and operations or being in quality assurance, as well as management and a small number of executives. If you are not familiar with the Jenkins Community Survey, it can be downloaded at cloudbees.com under the blog section. It is also available at jenkins.io, and when we wrap up at the end of this session, we'll have a link that you guys can follow. So I want to take the opportunity, actually, after speaking about those roles, to start a discussion amongst the group around the idea of DevOps roles. In our survey, we found that 51%, and noting this was a multiple choice question, so people could check multiple boxes, i.e. they could be a build manager or a manager and a lead, as well as consider themselves a developer. But looking at the responses, I found it interesting that a significant percentage considered themselves to be in a DevOps role. That was 51%. Also, what I found notable was the fact that we saw 20% identifying themselves as architects, which in my observation is a relatively new trend. In the early phases of CI and CD, I wasn't talking to architects when I went out and worked with clients or customers. So I'd like to first start by asking you guys, what are your thoughts on the DevOps role? Do you think it has value? Do you think it's valid? And Carl, I think I'll start with you, if you have some.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, when we first started seeing DevOps started, appearing in titles, most in the DevOps community started calling foul and saying, you can't have DevOps in your title. That's not DevOps, right? That's just another silo. But then the State of the DevOps report happened, and when we learned, what we learned from that is that people with DevOps in their title, or even groups, teams with DevOps in their charter, ended up having more success overall than those that didn't. And I think the reason for that is mainly it gives you attention. It gives you a reason for existing. And if that's what it takes to be successful, then do it. Like that, the data shows that that does work for a lot of organizations, especially ones who are skeptical of this DevOps thing. It's hard to change cultures. It's hard to change those things. And if you give a charter to somebody by putting it in their name or in their team's title, then that really seems to help.
Carl, would you say there's a difference between rebranding an ops team as a DevOps team and creating a new team called DevOps?
There's a lot of different models that we've seen, and I would say that, yeah, there is that model of, oh, we're just going to call our ops team the DevOps team and keep doing things the way that we've been doing, and those teams definitely don't be as successful. What we have seen, perhaps counterintuitively, is if you do create a separate team, that does seem to work. That team, all they do is create processes and work with other teams to bring them together. I recommend that team's charter to be to work themselves out of a job, but that seems to be what works best for a lot of larger organizations.
We've definitely found that as we when we rebranded, we ended up with people who weren't necessarily bought into the idea, developers that really wanted to be focused more on the development side of things. And so certainly our experience is that new teams make it easier for people to sort of self-select into that new team rather than the rebranding, which tends to have a longer tail in terms of getting where it really needs to be.
Awesome. Any other input on that, Curtis? What's your experience with the concept of a DevOps role and
having created a DevOps team, but about, I want to say it was at least 4 years ago now. So it was sort of before DevOps Enterprise Summit, and at a time when the thinking was only unicorns could do it. On my part, it was intentional, because to change a culture, you have to change language and behaviors, and it was a way to introduce this word into the lexicon, right? It was just really intentional about getting people to ask me, well, what the heck is DevOps? Because it was so new. So, but then, in terms of the actual roles within that team, it was all about being utility infielders, right? I just got a bunch of college kids with CIS, MIS, and CS degrees and started saying, look, there's nothing we can't do. Let's just all go figure it out. But yeah, so for me it was about introducing the language, but I did agree, I do think the goal of our team was to get to where we could stop using the word DevOps and the team sort of put itself out of work. But we were that original catalyst of bridging all kinds of different, between legal, security, ops, DBAs, middleware folks. We were facilitating all of those conversations about how can we make things work better. And that was sort of our job, was to just gather and centralize all that and roll out something that was awesome enough that people wanted to do more of it.
And well, I'm curious, guys. So in my experience, and sort of what I'm hearing that I wholeheartedly agree with, and it's been a shift in my thinking, is that there is value to identifying a DevOps title or a DevOps team, because it kind of puts a stake in the ground as to this is where we are moving. I have had concerns with specifically hiring for DevOps engineers. While it attracts people, it seems to suggest that DevOps is a specific domain of expertise when it comes to technical implementation. My feeling is that, yes, we can have DevOps terms, even down to engineers, but ultimately it should be about driving innovation and then distributing knowledge and lessons learned. Any comments on specifically the role of a DevOps engineer and the importance of not hoarding knowledge, but rather distributing across teams or groups?
Well, I'll say, you know, again, it was, to me, it's interesting, as someone who's watched HR and IT for a long time, I don't, even before DevOps, there was this idea that job postings wanted you to know like 30 different things, right? There was just this laundry list of skills they expected you to know. And DevOps now sort of gave them the green light to say, you need to know everything. And I'm with you in that it's not a set of skills. For me personally, I was hiring personalities. I was looking for people who had strong opinions, weakly held, that felt versatile and comfortable and flexible. And then we just, as a team, sort of grew from there, because when I was starting, the skills weren't identified, right? No one knew what those were. We had to go solve for those skills. So now that we're deeper into it, I think people are starting to think they know what it is again, but I wholeheartedly disagree. I think it's much more about personality and just basic cultural traits that you can bring to a team environment.
Right. And just to add to that, I mean, for a DevOps engineer, I mean, you need some accountability and ownership of the DevOps tools, right? I mean, of course, things have evolved. You know, there's new technologies and tools out there. Just sharing the real-life example of a client that I'm working with, I mean, going back to your point, Brian, architect's involvement is really critical in terms of defining the capacity requirements of platforms, you know, the number of applications that needs to be integrated, size of bandwidth requirements and all of that. So, you know, architect's involvement is very critical to the DevOps, and as well as DevOps engineering from the ownership point of view, and also accountability and sustainability, and also from the scaling point of view as well.
Great. Thank you, Sid. So with that, thanks for your input, guys. I want to go ahead and move on and take a look at what we got in terms of Jenkins adoption. Looking at the survey results, we found that between 2012 and 2016, the number of organizations that reported using Jenkins on more than 50 projects almost doubled. We also found that, continuing a trend with previous surveys, where it moves between 85 and 90%, the majority, and a large majority, had stated that their company's usage of Jenkins was increasing. I tend to find that what I'm sort of seeing is that as Jenkins is moving from kind of being viewed as a CI solution to a continuous delivery solution, I'm interpreting these results as being an indication of a trend of the adoption of CD moving from a single team and sort of going mainstream and grabbing hold across the organization. I am curious, and I'll go over to, I think here in this case, I'm going to go ahead and go over to Josh, who's actually in an organization that is leveraging Jenkins and practicing CD. Do you agree, or what's your experience? Do you agree that the increase in Jenkins adoption is kind of trending along with the increase of CD? And what's your thought on the general market?
Absolutely. I mean, one of the most interesting observations here, so as I mentioned in the intro, we've been doing this for about 10 years at different parts of the company. Started in the sports division because they were the bigger teams. They had the ability to sort of bootstrap something like this. And what I found was, even 5 years ago, the smaller dev teams had nothing. There was no CI, no CD, no anything for them unless they were able to sort of engage our services as a central team. At some point, it completely flip-flopped on us, and everybody was using Jenkins everywhere. The number of cases where some internal team that we might not already be engaged with comes to us and is doing nothing, those simply cease to exist. Every single team has Jenkins running. They're doing CI with it, potentially CD, and now would they come to us for best practices, for guidance, for taking that off of their hands so they can focus more on development. But definitely the adoption even inside this company has been phenomenal. As well with recruiting, I've seen, 5 years ago it was impossible to find college students, let's say, going back to those junior people that had any experience with this, and now I see people doing this for their personal projects. It's so easy to spin up a Jenkins server that that proliferation is huge.
I think the biggest change I would say across the industry is automation is, I almost want to say, intoxicating. Like when you get started with Jenkins or get started with a tool like Puppet or going further down the stack, tools like Terraform, like once you get one little thing automated, it sort of snowballs from there. And the usage that I've had, personally at companies is there's always like the one trailblazing project that is going to implement, we're going to have our full build, test, release cycle driven by Jenkins. And as soon as that team starts to use it and execute with that, other people see it, and other people, in the past, before we had pipeline as code, they would, copy jobs and things like that. But as soon as someone, even on a small scale, demonstrates that they can do something successful with Jenkins, everybody else around them seems to identify, oh, you don't have a release manager manually cutting builds anymore. That's great. We don't want to do that anymore. That's not something we want to do. And start emulating what they see from that, trailblazing team in the company. So a little bit of automation seems to kick off this snowball effect inside of an organization, which is really cool.
Well, so actually, that's a great point, Tyler, about sort of the cultural spread, and that sets me up to begin to segue into the next topic. While I agree automation is intoxicating, we do see data that says sometimes the growth of Jenkins and CD across the organization can be difficult to spread in a rapid way. And I guess I ask that I have for either you, Tyler, or anybody else that wants to chime in. What's some guidance that you guys have on how to accelerate the spread, right? So we've automated Jenkins, it's cool. Now, how do we accelerate getting other teams to do the same thing?
Right. So one of the things that I've experienced in a lot of companies I've worked for in the past is I became the Jenkins guy, quote unquote. And that seems to be a common theme across organizations, is there's somebody who takes a particular interest in Jenkins or in the build automation, and they start to plow ahead. The problem is that individual doesn't scale. And so what a lot of people have done historically is start to use tools like the Job DSL plugin or Jenkins Job Builder, and now that we have Jenkins Pipeline, using that to sort of build templates and build reusable components that can help the automation scale. And without that, like without investing in reusable components, it's not gonna spread across the organization, because not everybody wants to be a Jenkins expert. Most people want to build their software and go home. So the more tools that a shared services team or the group that's passionate about Jenkins can build, that can just be parachuted into different teams and reused, the easier it will be for them to take advantage of the automation without needing to be subject matter experts in the automation.
Awesome. Thank you, Tyler. And I'm just going to go ahead and jump into the next slide and then position for other people's comment. Just to frame this up, when we talk about sort of adoption across the organization, we use the term enterprise. I'm not necessarily here referring to a 5,000-10,000 person company, but rather a larger multi-team mature organization. And what we're finding here is really interesting results that 85% of respondents said that they were practicing Agile. 82% said they were practicing CI, 61% DevOps, and then there's an interesting drop between DevOps and CD that I think begs to the definition. 46 said they were practicing CD, so less people are practicing continuous delivery than DevOps. But we'll bookmark that for a sec to continue the other discussion, and then we can go back. What we also see is, when asked if you practice CD, how widely has it been implemented? Well, we see that 69% have adopted CD on a few teams or at least a few work groups, but only 15% have adopted across the entire organization. So Tyler spoke to the fact of sort of scaling what would be the Phoenix Project's Brent as an issue, right? Being able to distribute expertise. I'd like to ask you guys, and whoever would like to chime in, what do you think are some of the other challenges causing the gap between implementation on a few projects or work groups as opposed to the entire organization?
So I can say one thing that I've seen is a fear of that what you need in order to do CD is 100% pure automation. And if you don't have that, then you're not ready for CD. And I find that to be absolutely false. One of the things that I think people need to accept in order to get started with CD is that you don't have to have complete automation day one, that you don't have to have 100% test coverage on day one. Manual steps within a pipeline are expected and accepted to get started. What you really are after with continuous delivery is to have a pipeline that you can visualize, that you can measure, that you can communicate about, and you can see where are your bottlenecks, where are your handoffs that can be improved, where are the things that you're spending the most time on, where do the most breakages happen and why. And that's your next step. That's the next place to automate. But until you have that pipeline, until you have that way to measure and visualize everything and see how the process goes from keyboard to production, then you don't really have a great way of doing that. And then the fear perpetuates, and then the spread slows.
Okay. I agree with Carl, actually. I mean, so I think enterprises are hesitant to make large investments where they don't realize they don't have to buy enterprise set of tools and things that have to be already in place before you actually do it. I would agree with Carl. I think everybody should try to actually moving towards the automation, finding a process, and then make a requirement for the tools that it needs, right? So Jenkins is a good start, right, for the build automation, but then you actually implement your pipeline, and you actually go from there to find out the complexity of the application, and then define your requirements for the next tool set.
So we've also seen there's been resistance is perhaps too strong a word, but I'm going to go to obviously games as the example for this. Console games, the teams that do that stuff, I mean, generally the business model doesn't support delivering new versions of the game all the time. We cut annual releases, but what we've seen is sort of as mobile games have become more prolific, those newer, more modern teams are far more comfortable doing this. And if anyone plays games on their phone, you'll see that the release cadence of those things tend to be substantially greater. And so in addition, I totally agree with everything that's been said so far, but we've sort of also seen that teams that have not been doing it for a really long time just have an inertia that needs to be overcome.
I think Josh points out or touches on something that I've seen a lot from colleagues in the Jenkins project. A continuous delivery, at least as it's understood by most people, is something that people think is, oh, I'm deploying to a production, web application, website, etc., with some frequency. But it's actually fairly applicable in the mobile space, in the desktop application space, but the customer tends to be different, right? Like I'm just going to assume, Josh, I don't know anything about how EA works internally. But, there's manual testers, or there's stakeholders that need to receive nightlies, or, some frequency of a game that's in product. Maybe it's the producers that need to receive the game on a fairly regular basis. Continuous delivery, the pipeline could just cover that span, and you could have your automation to make sure that the producer is getting a good, pristine build of the the game or the title that's being worked on with some frequency, and that's where the CD pipeline could cover. And that still is progress, I think, and that's moving forward. But a lot of people have this impression that continuous delivery is just for SaaS companies or people that are pushing stuff up to AWS, when I really don't think it is.
Awesome. Yeah, Tyler, actually, and I'm going to want to stick on this a little longer than I think it's planned to branch off of that. We'll lead into sort of the adoption. I think we all would agree here that continuous delivery and DevOps is not just tools, right? Tools are a required component of it, right? But I like to refer to what is a common term that I term the DevOps Trinity, right? It's people and culture, process and practices, tools and technology. So this makes me want to call out sort of the spread of adoption of Agile, CI, DevOps, and CD. And Curtis, I want to start with you. What is your thought on the relationship between Agile and DevOps? Are they one and the same? Are Agile upstream practices required? So in terms of practices and culture related to DevOps, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, good question. So, but if I may, just before we jump forward, I want to just offer one more view on challenges to CD as I saw it at a Fortune 100 insurance company, which was we did it initially for a web app customer, a system of engagement, as a web app and some databases. That was one thing. But then what we started to realize is that there was hundreds and hundreds of different types of middleware, and we had to solve for each one of them. So I just thought that was one of the really huge challenges was, so after we did that system of engagement, we got profound benefit from going after our ETL platform because those were systems of integration that had broad impact across a lot of the portfolio. So we got the most bang for our buck out of that. But even after that, there's so many different web servers, there's so many different other types of middlewares out there when you're at a big company that literally owns virtually every technology ever produced, it's somewhere. So I just wanted to offer that as one more challenge to adopting CD because the last mile is hard and there's a lot of variation in a large organization. But back to your question about Agile, this is a really interesting topic to me because the history of Agile, in my opinion, is that a lot of companies dove into Agile and were very unsuccessful with it, largely because they tried to have this little Agile process wrapped by waterfall on both ends, and they just didn't have like a simple example is you're trying to do Agile and you don't even have self-service infrastructure, right? So to me, Agile was like, it was sort of the right idea to sort of get this going, but those Agile teams were never empowered enough to really do what they needed to do. And it's taken, in my opinion, the rise of DevOps, the rise of infrastructure as code, the rise of everything as code, to now allow Agile to flourish. So that's sort of I think it was a case of we sort of put the cart before the horse. In this case, we would have been much better off focusing on self-service infrastructure before we got into Agile.
Thank you. Yeah, and before we move on, I'd like to open up. I saw a bunch of head nods as Curtis was talking. Does anybody else have anything to add in terms of Agile and DevOps or cultural aspects of DevOps?
Just real quick, one of the things that I've seen about Agile in CI even is it ends up being a local optimization for a lot of companies where the development is now super fast and super agile, and they can really get things done in a very quick order, in a very quick speed. But then actually getting out to customers' hands takes another 3 months, right? Or figuring out what you want to build takes a year. So it's about seeing the process from idea all the way to completion. Where CD and DevOps really bring those together and say, look, we want to pull that optimization throughout the whole process, not just within development.
All right, great. And I'd like to just invite one more quick response before we move on to the next slide, because again, this seems to be a topic where we're in agreement. Josh?
Yeah, I could respond to both of those points really well. I think to Curtis's point, I totally understand your points on sort of the cart before the horse. The interesting thing from our perspective is I don't know if sort of feeling bad about why Agile wasn't working I think, helped the proliferation of DevOps. If we hadn't sort of had that and been like, okay, we know this is supposed to work, why didn't it? I don't know that it would have been as easy to embrace. So I totally agree with your points, but I think it was almost a necessary hurdle along the way. To Carl's point, just an interesting note for us, we have the benefit of releasing a packaged good, but the CI here definitely has achieved some of what you're talking about, that it is completely ingrained. I would use the anecdote of, obviously our games, it's important that we get them to, say, Walmart as an example. When they calculate backwards, they're going, okay, we need the game in Walmart on this day. It's going to take the trucks this long to drive to Walmart. It's going to take this long for things to be manufactured. They give us the window that we have to produce all of the builds for a particular game, get them to a particular location where they're going to be printed, and then off to actually Walmart. So it is so ingrained in it that it is actually part of that final, that last mile, genuine last mile, actually delivery.
Awesome. All right. Thank you, Josh. I'm going to now go ahead and thank you, everybody, for the comments on that. I think that's an important subject. Let's go ahead and jump forward, and I'd like to talk a bit about this concept of everything as code. I think that term is starting to take hold in the market, but for those that don't know what we refer to here, we're referring to the concept of managing as much of your application, as well as your application's delivery process and tooling, using code and software development methodologies. So the statistic that I'd like to start off this discussion with is based in the fact that when asking the Jenkins community if they're practicing continuous delivery, how are they defining their CD pipelines, we found that an impressive 54% are using the Jenkins pipeline as plugin or pipeline as code to describe their delivery workflow. This was introduced in October 2014. I believe went 1.0 in April 2015, so it's had a fairly short lifespan to have this level of adoption. I think a major part of it is that it really addressed the need that in the market that the overall everything as code movement is addressing. There's a couple of guys on this panel that are particularly close to this that I'm going to want to get to. I am going to want to start here with Tyler. And Tyler, let me ask you, what are your comments on sort of everything as code and what it means for CD and this whole concept of shifting left? I know you've applied it to the Jenkins infrastructure.
Yeah, so when I first really started to get overwhelmed by the responsibilities of Jenkins project infrastructure, that's when I had found Puppet, which at the time was really evangelizing the notion of infrastructure as code. And when I went from not, touching the machine directly, but describing in this DSL, a domain-specific language what the machine should do, and then I could do that repeatedly over and over and over again, that was a really compelling hook for me. And when we take that same sort of concept over to Jenkins with something like Jenkins Pipeline, part of the problem that we've had with, I would say, scaling Jenkins in the past is, the WYSIWYG job configuration is really, really great for sort of experimenting and moving forward. But as an organization grows or as your needs get more complex, it becomes very, very difficult to work with. And there's one piece of feedback that somebody gave me at an event one time. They said they hated configuring Jenkins because what they were trying to do was, in essence, visual programming. And as a visual programming tool, Jenkins sucked at that. And I thought that was a really insightful thing to say, because a lot of what I do with Jenkins is actually Turing complete. My pipelines have branches. They need to do different things. And bringing the power tools of a Turing complete language into my continuous delivery pipeline allows me to actually say what needs to happen, as opposed to checking a bunch of boxes or trying to figure out one thing or another. And it allows for really dynamic pipelines as well, which we've found within the Jenkins project has been very, very, very useful. There's a blog post I've been meaning to write that I still haven't gotten squared away, but we actually do a full continuous delivery pipeline for Terraform infrastructure on Azure, for example. And the same Jenkins file, which is how you describe the pipeline, right? The same Jenkins file we use for pull request validation. So when we receive a pull request, we'll stand up ephemeral infrastructure, validate it. We use that same thing for staging infrastructure, and then finally for production infrastructure with some manual changes. And because I have code, I can actually describe what I need to do there in a lot more terse and concise terms than I could in any sort of configuration, configuration language or configuration screens. And so it's, at least for me, the really important thing about pipeline as code is, continuous delivery to the last mile point that was made earlier does vary quite a bit depending on the organization. And we have had tools for ages to allow us to express complexity, and that's been as code. And now we have that, that tool for expressing complexity in our continuous delivery pipelines in Jenkins, which is, to me, one of the biggest changes in my use of Jenkins in the past eight years has been Jenkins Pipeline, which is phenomenal.
Yeah, and so
I'm really excited about it.
Something I'd like to comment on before I move to the rest of the group for answers is what I thought was really awesome to see is, not only does it give you a sort of a better way to reach the last mile, to oversimplify what you said, Tyler, but it was awesome as Tyler applied pipeline to Jenkins infrastructure, and I can sit here and look at the commit history on the Jenkins file that was driving the Jenkins deployment, and I can watch Tyler and Kosuke the founder of Hudson and Jenkins, collaborate on the delivery process, right? Identify where things should be improved. So apply software best practices and democratize the knowledge around the delivery pipeline. So it wasn't tied, as you said earlier, Tyler, everybody wasn't dependent on being a Jenkins expert, so to say. With that, Carl, I'm actually, Sid, I'm going to want to get to you in a moment because I'm interested in your thoughts. But Carl, in particular, you should have a unique perspective on sort of shifting left with the everything as code movement, because you actually created the Puppet Enterprise plugin for Jenkins Pipeline. Do you have thoughts on the impact of everything as code on the integration of the process across tools and teams?
Oh man, I have lots of thoughts. So Puppet is a great tool for you know, as Tyler mentioned, describing your infrastructure as code, and that really helps lay down the core infrastructure in the middleware that you're going to deploy your services onto, and also helps deploy those services themselves. But one of the things that we found is that actually applying that to a continuous delivery pipeline was exceptionally difficult. Sure, you could shell out to all the different systems you want to run Puppet on and be able to do that kind of promotion. But one of the things that we really wanted to make simple, or that I wanted to make simple with Jenkins, is being able to control that infrastructure as code approach applied to a continuous delivery pipeline, so that we could write, you know, update an application or update our infrastructure code and be able to move that through that pipeline. But you know, as Tyler was mentioning, doing that within Jenkins was actually fairly difficult because you had to define each and every step in this visual way that got very complex very quickly. So when I started looking into pipeline as code, I got very, very excited. Now my code repository that holds my Puppet code has the Jenkins file that defines the way I'm going to deliver it. Now my application can take advantage of my infrastructure code deployment system and live in the application service that I'm going to be delivering. And now we can all contribute, promote, we can all do peer review, all not just in the code itself that we're delivering, but the way it's getting delivered. That has huge implications to not just how infrastructure teams are going to be delivering infrastructure, but also how the application teams work with those infrastructure teams. Now it's so trivial to define the delivery process and define the steps that the infrastructure tool like Puppet is going to be taken as part of that deployment process.
Awesome. Thank you, Josh. And what I'm going to do is, because I do see we're pushing time a little bit, Sid, I wanted to get your comment on that, but I'm going to go ahead and move over to the next topic, which we'll move through very quickly, but I'd like to lead with you. What we are seeing is actually a pretty impressive stat in terms of Git adoption. The survey shows that Git has overtaken Subversion as a leading version control solution in a short 4 years, which is pretty impressive. The adoption of distributed version control solutions like Git seem to be tracking closely with the adoption of CD and DevOps. What I'd like to ask you, Sid, is why do you think it's true that DVCS is tracking with CD and DevOps? And if so, what is it about distributed version control that makes it a fit?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, this is very true representation of, you know, how enterprise is moving towards. In fact, at the client that I'm on, we actually moved this enterprise from SVN to Git, and the fact that, you know, the Git flow basically for the merge and branching strategies and a distributed way of doing things is much more kind of a collaborative, and that's the whole reason companies are looking to move away from, you know, Subversion and moving into Git flow of doing things. That's what I think.
Thanks, Sid. Josh, I'm actually personally curious, so I'm being a bit selfish here, but what do you use in your organization and why in terms of the predominant SCM?
So we've actually observed the exact pattern here as well. Generally, across the company, we use Perforce. This is simply due to the vast majority of items in our repository are going to be binary assets rather than actually code. That's video games, it makes sense. And so historically, Perforce was the tool that could actually do this effectively. At the scale we were at, we didn't have a lot of choice. But we've seen such proliferation in people's smaller projects or personal projects. There's been phenomenal pressure to figure out how to make Git work in this. And historically, that's been a closed case. People have been open to it. I don't know how many of you saw sort of Microsoft's article recently that they've been able to switch Windows to using Git, and that certainly opened a lot of eyes here, because it sounds like they have a lot of the same scale problems as us. So Perforce absolutely is the way to go, but Git is more interesting than it's ever been, even for us.
Awesome, man. Well, go ahead.
What I was going to say, because this is a particularly fascinating one for me, because and it sort of brings several things together, the previous slide and some other stuff, but with everything as code but this is a rare case where the tool has been a big facilitator of a culture change, right? So and with that, what I mean is I can't express how profound the pull request is in how things are developed, because now we've taken a traditionally late life cycle approval of a change, and it's now happening at the sort of commit time, or at least the merge time, right, with the form of a pull request. As someone who tried to get developers to do code reviews throughout my entire career and never successfully, Git now makes that very real, because code reviews are a natural part of a pull request process. It's changed all of the team dynamics. And so this is a case, it's not about distributed versus centralized. It's really, in my opinion, it has so much to do with the pull request and satisfying compliance things right there at the beginning, and not waiting till late, and the collaboration and teamwork that it's fostering. So that to me has been one of the more profound changes, in addition to everything as code, that we've seen in recent years.
Agreed. I think that's an important point. I particularly like how you called out that it's kind of the tool driving the culture change. So I'm going to jump ahead so we ensure that we leave time for questions. Of course, we've talked about Jenkins, which is a solution for automating and orchestrating continuous delivery in DevOps. At the end of the day, we're looking to use these processes and solutions like distributed version control system to get an application out to a customer, right? To take us from concept to customer. So in talking about this automation, we asked the community, what level of automation have you implemented with Jenkins? One, CI for build and test, sort of the simple traditional Jenkins usage. CD with manual deployment to production, or CD with fully automated deployment to production. And what was interesting is that we found while 45% were using continuous delivery practices on Jenkins to get to production, only 13% had fully automated deployment to production. And I'd like to use this to ask, sort of a couple of things, and you guys can answer however you feel fit. One is why. Second is specifically, what role does continuous delivery have in legacy organizations that tend to have very right-hand side orchestration-centric application release automation processes? And I'll sort of open the floor here for comment to anybody that wants to chime in.
I'm going to go back to Carl's earlier statement. I think this is a pretty tricky question in the survey because of fully automated deployment.
Right.
And I would be curious, how many of them actually have an automated deployment process, but maybe it's not tied to ERM and CMDBs and some other, and some other governance and compliance type issues, but it's still an automated deployment. So I kind of go to Carl, that I think that's a tricky term, because if it's not fully, they're scared. And then I would point back to it's a left to right process, and there's a lot of deployment technologies that I pointed out before. So I think there's going to be a long tail on some of that.
Well, one thing in particular I think is worth pointing out here is that when you ask a question like this, a lot of times what you're really asking is, are you using an ARA process? Are you using some sort of ARA tool? And the answer to that may be no. Like, we may have some sort of manual process of deploying out a build and starting the service up, but we actually automate the underlying infrastructure there. And it's not tied together. But one of the things we're seeing over the last year or two is that convergence, that now people are starting to recognize that configuration management tools and the automation of the middleware and infrastructure is a part of that application deployment process. And they're starting to see, like, how do we actually merge that together and do it all either with one tool or with one process within one stage in a pipeline. And so I imagine that 13%, I'd want to dive into that a little bit more, but I imagine a lot of that 13% is we've successfully combined those processes, not so much that we do literally everything by hand.
Right. That's a good point. And I think, yeah, the interpretation is going to be based on the actual question. Well, what I'm going to want to do here, guys, is unfortunately, I don't have all day to talk to you guys. Hopefully, we can sync up at some point over beers and record it and then ship it out. But I absolutely want to leave. It looks like a ton of questions have been coming in on the panel. So I want to leave a few minutes for questions and then move into closing statements. And I will just start to pick through. Actually, here's an interesting one that I'm going to direct to Tyler because it sort of hits to the core of the title Jenkins Community Survey. Tyler, how does one get involved in the Jenkins project?
Oh my, we have so many opportunities for involvement. So on Jenkins.io, which is the project homepage, there's a link at the top called Participate, or just Jenkins.io/participate. The easiest way to really start to get involved, I think, is in filing tickets or in writing blog posts for Jenkins.io. One of the things that we've learned through the Jenkins area meetup, the JAM program, where we have these regional localized meetups, is that a lot of people have really interesting uses for Jenkins or different approaches to solving similar problems. And so sharing that at a jam or creating a guest post on Jenkins.io is probably the easiest way to sort of dip into the Jenkins project and the Jenkins community and contribute something that you most certainly already have.
Awesome. And we encourage, go ahead, Josh.
I was going to say, I have an extra point. So one thing that we actually did, now we have a fairly large team, but we had a potentially bad habit of forking code locally, making changes to it, and not planning on contributing back. Internally in our organization, we made a policy, which is if we take something, I will not allow anyone, unless they have like an NDA reason, to not return that back. So if we make any changes to plugins, I'm forcing them to contribute, and that substantially improved our ability to contribute back to the Jenkins open source project.
Awesome. And
the thing I would like to add on to that, and first, thank you for doing that. That is a great policy to have in place. The Jenkins project is its own sort of entity, and so the future of what Jenkins is depends on who shows up and who participates. So if Jenkins is really important to your organization and the future of Jenkins is something that you care about, then finding some way to participate in the creation of Jenkins is a great way to make your use case heard, make your needs heard, and help make sure that Jenkins is going to be the right tool for you over the next 10 years as it has over the previous 10. Back to you, Brad.
We have about 5 more minutes left. I'm going to try to get through 3 to 4 more questions, guys. A question here that I find interesting, we didn't get a cover in terms of the discussion, is do Dockers and containers help with continuous integration and continuous delivery, or are they just there for platform independence and or horizontal scaling, right? So do they help CI/CD, or are they just there to enable you to deploy things independent of the host platform? And I think the answer is yes and yes, but I'm curious what you're going.
So at least on Jenkins, containers, especially when paired with the Docker pipeline plugin, for example, and the newer declarative pipeline syntax, actually open up a lot in terms of self-determination for CI/CD by allowing developers and teams to sort of describe what their environment should be for performing a build or a test in a container. Actually frees up the Jenkins administrator or the shared services team to do a lot of other stuff and sort of unlock that team to say, I'm building a Node application, here are my dependencies, go build and test my Node application. Whereas a Java team could do something different. And so I think they're actually really, really important to, was the word used, democratizing CI/CD across an organization, especially when paired with Jenkins.
Well, I'd paraphrase that a little bit even to, if it reduces the instances of it works on my machine, then it's definitely helping CI and CD.
Right.
Right.
So I'm going to go in, and honestly, guys, I'm looking at these questions. These are the best questions that I've had of any webinar. Unfortunately, I just have to try to pick what I can of a group of all winners. I'm interested in this. Any advice on knowledge sharing, especially at scale across multiple things? I think sharing of knowledge is sort of central to DevOps. Any comments, guys?
I think that goes right back to infrastructure as code. You know, one of the things that we talk a lot about in terms of infrastructure as code is having executable documentation. That in itself is a way to share knowledge. It's a way to share expertise. I, as an expert in databases or message queues or whatever else, can now codify that knowledge and that experience and give you a clean, simple interface to be able to use it and be able to consume that and be able to contribute back to it when you learn enough to be able to modify it. You know, that in and of itself has been massive for a lot of organizations to be able to share knowledge and be able to scale it across teams that may not have even talked to each other before.
All right. I'm going to squeeze in an easy, low-hanging fruit. Is there documentation for best practices for Jenkins pipeline and Jenkins file? Tyler, no need to answer. Go to jenkins.io or go.cloudbees.com. There's a wealth of documentation to get you started in implementing pipeline as code there. Let me ask, so someone asked, actually I think this is a good one, what is the ideal size for a DevOps team, as we discussed earlier, in an organization of about 50 developers? I don't think there's a rote fixed answer for that, but I want to prompt comment or discussion on that.
Yeah, so I don't think there's a fit answer to that, but size of 50 developers, right? I mean, the DevOps team can be 1 or 2 person team, right? So going back to the DevOps engineer is one, and you need a deployment engineer. So yeah, I mean, it really depends on the size of the team, size of the organization, because in my recent experience at the client that I'm on, we are actually proposing a DevOps organization. But this organization is, of course, quite big, and they have about more than 400 developers in their team. So we are kind of approaching from a top-down, you know, from a DevOps lead to having multiple DevOps engineers and configuration management engineers, and also from a deployment standpoint, you know, from a deployment engineering point of view. So, you know, for the size of, you know, over 300 developers, we're kind of approaching that, you know, we may need 4 to 5 team members for the DevOps.
Awesome. Thank you, Sid. And guys, I mean, sincerely, unfortunately, we are at time. What I do want to do is give each of you guys 30 seconds to go around and provide some closing statements, closing guidance, or advice. I'm going to go in the direction of the panel here. Well, actually, we'll go with the guy on the phone. Tyler, do you have any closing comments?
I thank you for everybody that contributed to the survey and that contributes to the project. Between Jenkins pipeline and the recently announced Blue Ocean 1.0, I think the Jenkins project is having the best 2 years in its history, and it's very, very poised in the direction of continuous delivery. So all of those last mile concerns that were shared earlier are concerns that I hold, and I welcome anybody who wants to help make Jenkins the continuous delivery driver for the next 10 years to join the Jenkins project. And we look forward to having you. That's it.
Thank you, Tyler. Curtis?
I just want to say I think it's just a really exciting time to be here, because as someone who started down this road years ago, what I've witnessed since then is a real maturation of tools and capabilities that are making things easy, if not possible, that just were not so easy a while ago. So I think, you know, the rise of Git, pipelines, a variety of things have just, it's a perfect storm, and it's a great time to be heading down into this journey.
Thank you much, Curtis. Josh?
I would second all of what Curtis said. It is a brave new world. I can tell you I've been doing largely the same type of work for electronic arts for a little over a decade now, and that probably seems insane to a number of you guys. If anyone on this conversation is with a company and they feel like they're at the beginning of this stretch, it might absolutely take some time, but if you've got the interest, you've got the will, you can absolutely change the world and have just massive impact.
Great. I love change the world. Sid, over to you.
Same sentiments. Very excited to be a part of this and defining the the future of DevOps, and from a DevOps point of view, actually also going forward, what our approach is going to be from our organization's perspective, from strategy, and it's a journey, right? It's a journey. Enterprises have to start somewhere, where it's build automation, integration, or managing their CIs or deployments. So very excited to be part of this, and just continue to learn. And as for the knowledge share, also we're at Zebra, we also do write white papers and share documentation like that back to Jenkins.
All right, thank you. And Carl, last but absolutely not least.
Yeah, I just want to say thanks for all the great conversations. It's been fantastic. I definitely recommend that you look into infrastructure as code to help do that last mile delivery. Puppet.com/Jenkins will help get you started, but there are lots of great solutions out there, and I hope you pick one that works for you.
All right, awesome. And I want to thank the attendees for joining, and I in particular want to thank the panelists for participating in your organizations, for letting you participate. I wish we had 3 to 4 hours to sit here and do this. Max, do you have any closing comments or housekeeping items before final wrap?
I just want to remind everyone that this was recorded, so we'll be sending this out to you in a few days, and I'm going to collect all the questions that were asked, and we'll see if we can manage to try to answer more of them.
All right, awesome. Thank you, panelists. Thank you, audience. You guys have a great day.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you, Brian.
Bye, guys.